Reef restoration efforts that take years to grow could be wiped out in a single day if they're not prepared for climate change. At Iberostar, we're designing our restoration efforts to maximize genetic diversity and resilient coral to be prepared for the bleaching we know will come to the Caribbean basin. Today, we'll take an in-depth look on what we could lose if we don't prepare our efforts for climate change and some hopeful breakthroughs that show it is possible to be on the winning side of bleaching. My name is Dr. Megan Morikawa, and I'm the Global Director for Sustainability at Iberostar Group. And we've got a great discussion ahead of us today with Dr. Carly Kenkel, who's our Assistant Professor at University of Southern California, and Dr. Joanna Calle, our Science Coordinator for Wave of Change Movement at Iberostar. Let's go ahead and dive right into the conversation. And Carly, I think when we talk about bleaching and corals, it can get a little bit technical. So I'm wondering if you could give us a quick overview of what some of the challenges reefs generally face in the face of climate change.
So climate change brings with it a variety of different stressors, right? We typically think about temperature, but there's also acidification, sea level rise, hypoxia. But really the reason that we think about temperature is that it really is the biggest challenge that corals face today because it's responsible for global mass bleaching events, meaning that corals are bleaching worldwide, typically at the same time or in the same year, which is a huge stressor. Every species is subject to that on every reef. And that bleaching is so detrimental, is so bad for the corals because they lose their primary food source. So when corals bleach, they lose the little symbiotic algae that lives inside of their tissues. And without that food source, essentially it's a time to starvation. So they're slowly starving to death until that stress goes away. And if it doesn't, then they can very well die.
One of the things that I think was a really important guiding light for a call to action for coral reefs was when the IPCC report was released on the ocean and cryosphere last year, stating basically that even if we curb global climate change and achieve only 1.5 degrees of warming by 2050, we could still lose 90% of reefs to a lot of these stressors that you were just mentioning. For us, it's one of the reasons why we hope and believe that reef restoration can play a role in combating some of these challenges, but it's not something that comes for free. And I know that in my PhD work, I was working on seeing if we could prepare reef restoration efforts for climate change by looking at natural existing diversity that we still have today, running a couple of quick tests to see whether or not some of the winners and losers that we could predict in simple assays, like actually exposing them, little fragments of them to artificial bleaching events, or looking at their microclimates to see if some coral actually grew up in warmer climates and they were likely to survive better the stresses that did come. That research that I was doing in American Samoa demonstrated that when two natural bleaching events actually did come, we were able to take a pretty good chance at predicting who the winners and losers were, which would hopefully help us to inform some of those reef restoration efforts. But one of the reasons we're excited to talk to you as well, Carly, is the work that you guys are doing at your lab at USC. You guys are focusing on a lot of this work. So can you tell us a little bit as well, not only on some of the work that you're doing, but how that could help us to play a role for restoration to better combat climate change?
Some of your work, Megan, is we're exploring similar topics because I think that is going to be super critical. Is one, can we identify individuals that have the ability to withstand temperature stress better than others? And for my lab, we're also trying to understand how withstanding temperature stress might come at a cost or a trade-off of withstanding other stressors. So, we asked the question, just because you're good at temperature, does that also mean you're good at dealing with acidification or some of eutrophication or some of the other stressors that might be coming along with climate change? Because as we said, it's not just temperature, even though that is the biggest player. And some of the exciting things that we've discovered is that, similar to Megan, there are winners when it comes to temperature stress. There's definitely some individuals, some coral already, that are better able to tolerate temperature than others, which is super encouraging. And the other thing we're finding, at least in the few studies that we've done, that it seems like some individuals do seem to have general tolerance, that they're able to withstand, like if they're good at temperature, they can also be good at acidification, or there doesn't appear to be a cost to being good at temperature stress, that it seems like they can withstand some other stressors, which is great news for restoration, because it means that maybe practitioners, if they can identify those individuals within their stocks, they could potentially focus on those individuals or use those individuals more in their restoration designs to say, we're putting some climate resilience into our restoration as we move corals around.
But a lot of times there's an assumption that there's not really enough diversity in the Caribbean to be able to do this. This is one of the reasons why I'm excited about your work, because you've actually looked in some of these regions. Is there enough diversity? Are some of these findings also happening in the Caribbean basin?
We've started working, so for our work, we've started working on the acroporids, so Acropora cervicornis and Acropora palmata, and we're definitely finding variation within those species in terms of their ability to withstand temperature and other stressors in some of our collaborations. So I would certainly say on a species level, the variation is definitely there. The problem for some areas, most of my work is done in Florida, is that the population itself has just been so reduced that you're just dealing with a very low number of individuals, period. And that even if you have the most tolerant individual in that population, just having a really small population presents its own set of risks.
In some of our other conversations, this is why we had a lot of discussion about this is why you need to act now, right? As we're starting to lose coral not only from bleaching events, global mass bleaching events in the Caribbean, we also have disease and other incidences where we are losing corals. And so I think this is a really great point, that this diversity is important, but it's diversity that we need to be able to find before we lose it to something else, because no coral can survive being dredged, or no coral can survive a major incident like that, which we want to make sure that we can find some of that diversity. If we were able to actually implement some of these findings into the practices of reef restoration, Joanna, can you tell us a little bit of how much of a difference could this make if we considered climate change as one of the fundamentals in our reef restoration efforts when we begin?
Of course, thank you, Megan. Yes, in fact, we are starting our coral restoration program in Mexico, and in the Mexican Caribbean has registered devastating bleaching events and disease in the last 3 years. So what we are observing is that we have only the most resilient individuals who have been able to adapt and survive in challenging conditions. So we are also focused on cultivating corals that can withstand harsh natural conditions. And we must consider climate change because it is already affecting our communities and the global ecosystem.
In Mexico, we have perhaps the fortunate case, or very unfortunate case, of having a lot of loss already in that region that may have unveiled some of the winners of at least disease and potentially some other features in the area. But hopefully these are decisions that we can employ in other areas. Carly, I know that some of the work that you guys are doing is looking at assessing an entire population to see whether or not this diversity exists. Do you think this could make a difference in reef restoration efforts today if we were able to implement some of these technologies or assays?
I certainly think so. If it's more work to ask practitioners to take on, but if they're able to go out and do these experiments, or just even qualitatively, if there's, you're out in your nursery and it's a hot summer and you see that coral bleached and that one didn't, that's great information to be able to use. To say this individual is more resilient. Another way to use that information is to say, right, practitioners have the best knowledge of their local conditions, right? They're on the reefs every day. They're going to know the reef that's hotter, the reef that's cooler, maybe the reef that experiences a little more damage or a little more runoff. And you can use that knowledge to say, to source individuals for your nurseries. You can say, okay, I'm going to kind of diversify my collections so that I'm collecting representatives that are already living in these conditions, that are experiencing more stress, and in that way, try to increase the resilience of my nursery stock.
No, I think that's a great representation of the fact that there's not only the fantastically quantified research that you guys are doing, but also some rules of thumb that probably get you a lot of the way there, that are based off of local knowledge and observation, which is one of the greatest things about being consistently present in the field and observing these sorts of situations is, these corals are responding all of the time to the environment around them. And if you're capturing the information about that environment and capturing the information about how corals are responding to that can hopefully help us to choose ultimately who are the ones that are going to be the main breadwinners of the restoration efforts, while also balancing those baselines that we're also beginning to better understand more and more of how much genetic diversity do we need represented from a region to make sure that we're also accounting for the diversity that we would like to be able to maintain in the long run. Joanna, I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about those that are working on some of these restoration efforts, some of the ways that they are helping to build resilience in the face of climate change.
Yeah, also they can help maybe reduce local stressors, such as physical impacts to the colonies, maybe by setting up signaling buoys, implementing or supporting projects that promote the creation of MPAs, supporting and participating in action plans, as well as monitoring and following up. By doing this, stress is reduced, and at the same time, species and ecosystem processes such as recruitment, connectivity, increasing biomass of herbivores, and improvement of water quality are being protected. No? These actions can support a system's ability to resist and recover from disturbances, and can become more resilient to bleaching and disease events.
When we think about how the private sector can help with this specific problem, preparing restoration efforts for climate change, it can seem a little distant, right? Because a lot of this work might need to happen in a laboratory setting, or certainly be informed at a minimum by scientific literature and some of the latest findings, which are constantly evolving. But at Iberostar, we have a little bit of a take saying, this is information that you can coordinate all at once and can integrate all together. One of the ways that we've done this, on ways the private sector has helped, is by having our own internal science team. Joanna came to us from work that she was doing in her PhD in the Dominican Republic, where she was actually helping us to establish baseline genetic diversity in the nursery that we're helping to maintain there alongside Funimar. Another way that we tried to help contribute from the private sector was saying, look, we have facilities in the region. We have the expertise and know-how to be able to help build additional facilities that house corals, that complement work that other groups have been doing in the region. We did that in the Dominican Republic in our Bávaro complex, where we built a facility, a coral lab, that was available for outreach for our clients so that they could see a real coral on their stay without having to get into the water, which we know is a barrier. But also we could do some of these preliminary stress tests to see if we could find some of the winners and losers, and actually had our experts in who helped us design our pools and heating facilities and air conditioning units help us design the same systems that allowed us to be able to recreate bleaching events for corals. And then finally, we also are working in collaborations, right? And we had the great opportunity to invite one of your PhD students to come to our facility last year to do some of his work on looking at diversity in populations in the Caribbean, but those also are helping directly us to better understand some of the baseline genetic diversity that could go alongside the thermal tolerance tests that we're performing in the Coral Lab. So I think what we wanted to show was that there were ways in which the private sector could directly contribute to helping to combat this problem once they started to dive into doing reef restoration. I know you have also a story on ways other private sector has been involved throughout this, and I'm wondering if you can tell us as well on some other examples and the ways that private sector have helped us to actually take steps forward to help prepare reef restoration efforts for climate change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, all of those things are incredible. Certainly, the support that Iberostar has given to reef restoration is such an incredible example of how the private sector can make a real impact in this field. And one of the other things that I think is really important is communication. So, because you have such a broad audience and such a big platform already, using that in a way to engage the public and educate the public, and especially on topics that are perhaps a little more controversial. Certainly in the Caribbean, we're talking about some very drastic interventions. So not just managing diversity, but possibly manipulating diversity, doing some additional breeding from corals from different, not even just different reefs, different countries, in order to kind of increase the diversity in regions that are particularly failing right now. And that's something that goes beyond the science, right, and starts to get into the social and the political. And in that area, like, the private sector can be invaluable in helping get that message and get feedback from the public about what do you think about these ideas? Is this something you'd be willing to support? Is this something we should be doing? So having that engagement and relationship is so critical, and where I really see value in engaging with the private sector. Because for me as a single scientist, I love doing outreach, but I just don't have the platform to be able to reach that kind of an audience.
So it's our hope that we've given some good examples on ways in which the private sector and others in the tourism industry can choose goals for reef restoration, focus on helping us learn more about some of the reefs in important touristic destinations like the Caribbean Basin, and also have a taste of how they can help to prepare those efforts for climate change using some rules of thumb. Because I think it's very clear to a business that any investment that you're making today, if you're going to lose it in a single day that will come in the future, you really want to make sure that you're doing what you can to prepare the efforts that you're doing today to be able to withstand in the long run to the best of our scientific knowledge. And so hopefully this has given a good overview of what are some of the challenges that reef restorations face in climate change, but also some solutions that we have amongst that. So thank you so much, Joanna and Carly, for your comments and discussion.